Hi, and welcome to this live reading from Holiday Hope, Holiday Express Book 1 by Shanna Hatfield, and this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Chapter 1, 1884. A bump in the track jostled Coralie Schuster from a restless slumber. Weary from days of travel across the great expanse of the United States, she hesitated to open her eyes and begin the day. She'd climbed into the upper berth of the train car more than ready to rest last night, but sleep had proven elusive through the long midnight hours. Plagued by thoughts of what her immediate future might hold when she arrived in Holiday, a newly constructed town in the wilds of eastern Oregon, she found it impossible to relax and fully surrender to her dreams. Had she been completely crazy to travel all the way from Cincinnati to marry a rancher? She supposed the answer to that question would become clear soon enough. By noon, the train would arrive in Holiday, and she'd meet her intended, Jude Coleman. Would he be a man as gritty and tough as the images his name conjured in her mind? Or someone kind, someone she could come to love? Coralie drew in a deep breath, needing to clear her thoughts. Instead of a cleansing lungful of air, she inhaled a stale, sour odor that put her in mind of rancid cabbage. Nose wrinkled in disgust, she started to rise, only to find the braid she'd fashioned last night pinned down, prohibiting any movement. Curious, she reached up and felt around the top of her pillow until her fingers encountered something both bony and hairy. A scream clawed upward in her throat as she envisioned a wild animal curled around her head. When the offending weight shifted, she squelched the urge to shriek and quickly sat up. She glanced over her shoulder to see two incredibly large hairy feet resting in her berth. Coralie rolled her eyes, then glanced down at a noise from the berth below her. Anne Charles, her newly acquainted friend, pressed a hand over her mouth to keep from bursting into laughter. When Coralie made a silly face, the two women could no longer hold back their humor. Coralie buried her face into the mattress while Anne held a pillow over her face. Once their amusement subsided, Anne rolled to the edge of her berth and shook her head. "What a way to begin your day," she whispered. "I thought something had crawled by my head and died," Coralie spoke in a hushed tone. "Maybe the fellow has passed on to glory, and that's why his feet stink so much." "Shh, he might hear you. At least, I hope that those gigantic things belong to a man. I'd hate to think of a woman having such enormous feet or hairy legs." Just then the feet twitched, and the owner pulled them back inside his berth, causing the two women to laugh again. "We might as well get ready for the day," Anne said, reaching beneath her berth and handing Coralie her satchel. "Agreed, if we hurry, we might even beat the line to the lavatory," Coralie said, hurrying to dress in the cramped quarters. Hastily changing from her nightgown into a traveling dress that would forever be embedded with soot from the coal that powered the train down the track, she sat cross-legged on the bed, combing her hair, her mouth full of hairpins. The train lurched around a curve, throwing her off balance. She spewed the hairpins onto her lap, lest she swallow them. Grasping onto the berth brace kept her from shooting right off the bed, but her traveling companion didn't fare as well. Anne squealed as she was thrown out of her berth into the center aisle, landing on her backside with her dress slipping down one shoulder. Coralie shoved the pins into her hair, hopped off the berth, and stepped between Anne and two interested-appearing men dressed in Western garb as they moved closer. She held a hand out to Anne, helped her to her feet, then pushed her back behind the curtain surrounding their berth. With a curt nod to the men, she followed Anne into the bit of privacy afforded by the curtain and helped to right the woman's rumpled clothing. "Well, that's one way to get the blood flowing first thing," Coralie said with a smile. "I am mortified," Anne hissed. Her entire face was a bright shade of pink as she smoothed her dress, then nervously fussed with her hair. "Don't be. At least you didn't have smelly feet next to your face." Anne's tense shoulders relaxed slightly. "True, I only fell into the midst of the car with men ogling me from every direction," she said with a hint of sarcasm. "Oh, it wasn't nearly that dramatic." Coralie took the brush from Anne and gave the woman's luxuriant brown hair several strokes before fashioning it into the high pompadour her friend favored. "There, all ready." "Perhaps those who were awake returned to sleep," Anne said as they pulled back the curtains and stepped into the aisle. "Or it could be everyone was awakened by our jolting ride," Coralie said, leading the way to the lavatory. At least they were fortunate to be traveling in a car that had a lavatory for ladies and another for gentlemen. In fact, Coralie had been both surprised and amazed by how nice her accommodations had been the entire trip. She'd half anticipated traveling in the immigrant car, but for the most part she'd been comfortable and well fed. As she and Anne waited for a turn in the lavatory, she glanced at the woman with whom she'd felt an immediate kinship. They'd met in Omaha while they were waiting to board the train that would carry them west. Anne was a proper Englishwoman. She'd arrived in America a year ago with her maidenly aunt. The woman had passed not long after they'd settled into a small home in New York City. It had taken Anne months to sort through the paperwork, only to discover the woman who was also her guardian had left her penniless. Unable to find suitable work, Anne had decided to take a chance on the unknown and become a mail-order bride. Coralie could well relate to Anne and her story of being forced to make a choice between poverty, working in a deplorable job, or accepting an offer of marriage from a complete stranger. The idea of marriage seemed far more palatable than the other options, so here she was, on her way to Holiday. The discovery that Holiday was also Anne's destination nearly made her weep with joy. Anne had agreed to wed the owner of the local livery and blacksmith shop. Coralie could hardly envision the petite, elegant Anne married to some hulking brute who smelled of sweat, iron, and horses, but she hoped her friend would find happiness in the unconventional union. Coralie contemplated her own impending marriage to a man she didn't know. The last letter she received from Jude had said he'd give her time to get acclimated to ranch life before they wed. At least she wouldn't be immediately pressed into the role of a wife. She knew from Jude's letters that he resided on Elk Creek Ranch, just north of town. He, along with his father and brother, raised beef cattle and also trained horses they sold to the military. Jude had also mentioned their property included timber, so she assumed the town had to be in the mountains or close to them. She'd never heard of Holiday before she'd answered Jude's advertisement for a wife. She'd even attempted to locate the town on a map, but it had only been founded 6 years prior when a large gold strike drew men to the area. Now that money poured into town from the mine, respectable businesses had been established and many men actively sought wives. Coralie had spent her entire life residing in a busy city. Her family had never even owned a horse or a dog, living in an apartment above her father's shoe store. Oh, they'd been happy, the three of them. Her father had provided well for his family by making and repairing shoes, and her mother had created a wonderful, loving home for them all to enjoy. Now her parents were gone, and Coralie had been left without many options for her future. The closer she got to Holiday, the more she questioned if she'd chosen the right path. What if her intended was a horrible man, one who'd written lies to her? She'd heard about mail-order brides being deceived. There hadn't been time to exchange photographs with Jude, even if she'd had a recent one to send, which she did not. No, the last photo that had been taken of her was carefully packed in her trunks, with her other keepsakes that would remind her of her parents and her heritage. I shall greatly look forward to our arrival on Holiday, if for no other reason than to conclude our time being tossed about on a rocking, rumbling train, Anne said as they finished in the lavatory and returned to their seats. The porter had folded up the berths, pushed aside the curtains, and made the area ready for the day. Coralie nodded. It will be nice to have this long journey behind us. She stowed her satchel beneath the seat, pinned on her hat, and settled back as the train continued chugging down the tracks. Anne and Coralie purchased breakfast when the train stopped at a small town just across the Idaho border in Oregon. A farmer and his wife boarded, selling fresh milk, hot donuts, and boiled eggs. The two women gladly parted with a few coins for the food, and enjoyed every bite as the train pulled away from the station. 2 hours later, the porter walked through the passenger car. "Baker City, folks. Baker City coming right up." Pardon me, sir," Anne said, smiling up at the man. "Might you be able to confirm the travel arrangements for the remainder of our journey?" She handed him her ticket. "Yes, ma'am," he said with a friendly smile. "You'll switch trains in Baker City. The Holiday Express line will take you right into Holiday. You can't miss it. The train is a beaut, shiny like a new penny." He tipped his cap to them, returned the ticket to Anne, and continued on his way through the car and on to the next one. "I wish we had time to explore Baker City," Anne said, looking out the window as the train rolled past the sea of cattle. Cowboys rode along a fence, and one of them lifted his hat, offering a jaunty wave. "I wonder if all the men here are like that," Coralie asked as she gazed out the window, fighting down the urge to return the welcoming greeting. She'd expected the landscape to be different, but nothing had prepared her for the rolling hills covered in what she'd learned was called sagebrush. It seemed almost barren, desolate to her, although not quite as lonesome as the prairies they'd traveled across. Would Holiday be surrounded by scrubby brush, dirt, and not much else? She hoped not. Although it was just the first day of November, she'd expected to see snow on the ground, but it appeared none had fallen yet. That at least made traveling easier for everyone. She and Anne were both watching out the window as the train rolled into the station at Baker City. True to what they'd heard about the mining town, it was bustling with activity. "Welcome to Baker City," the porter said as he took a position at the steps leading out of the car to help the women as they departed the train. "Perhaps another time we can travel back here to investigate what appears to be a thriving town," Anne said as they made their way over to where a train, as shiny and new as the porter said, was loading passengers. It didn't hold any sleeping cars, but the passenger car they stepped into was nicely appointed with upholstered seats all facing forward. "How lovely," Anne said, smoothing her gloved hand over the back of a seat. "Would you like to sit by the window or the aisle?" "The aisle's fine with me," Coralie said, settling beside her friend. They slid their satchels beneath the seats, sank back against the soft cushions, and anxiously awaited the beginning of the last leg of their journey. Coralie took in the mahogany paneling, the stained glass framing the windows, the extraordinary details of the passenger car that made her feel like she'd entered a luxurious world she'd only dreamed of one day experiencing. They didn't have long to wait before the train began to move and chugged away from the station. From what Coralie could tell, they were heading due east, but she knew from Jude's letters that Holiday was located north of Baker City. Curious but not concerned, she and Anne stared out the window at the hills of sagebrush. "This must seem even stranger to you than it does to me," she said to her seatmate. Anne turned to smile at her. "Oh, I think it is probably quite different than either of us anticipated, but perhaps there is a beauty to be found in the ruggedness of this place." "It is rather rugged," Coralie said, patting Anne's hand as they returned to watching out the window. "Did you notice the name painted on the engine of the train?" Hope. Coralie thought the name of the train quite fitting. Earnestly, she'd hoped she'd done the right thing in agreeing to come to Holiday to marry a stranger. "I can't think of a better name of the conveyance carrying us to the end of our journey. Hope is what I have for our future, and hope is what we'll have to lean on as we begin a new life in Holiday." "Exactly. We shall cling to hope and friendship and faith." Anne playfully bumped her arm. "And perhaps our handsome husbands." Coralie laughed. "I hope it will be so." As the train chugged down the tracks, it changed directions, traveling north. With each passing mile, Coralie grew more nervous until she felt like she might explode. What if this trip had been a huge mistake? What if Jude was a horrid man? What if she spent the rest of her life in misery? Unable to sit still, she rose from her seat. "Where are you going?" Anne asked, glancing from the window to Coralie. "Is something wrong?" I just need to stretch my legs for a bit." Anne nodded in commiseration. "I can hardly wait to go for a stroll through Holiday. It will be nice to walk after sitting for so many days on end." The woman rose slightly and glanced toward the back of the car. "Perhaps no one would mind if you walk from one end of the car to the other a few times." "I guess we'll find out," Coralie said, taking a few steps to the front of the car. She turned, then headed back toward the back. She nearly reached the door when the train jerked, brakes squealing, and a few passengers shouted in surprise as they ground to an unexpected bone-jarring halt. She cast a questioning look over her shoulder toward Anne. What on earth was happening?